this computer. All right, so we should be ready to go. 20% here. All right, so thanks again, everyone, for making it out tonight. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to come. We're all here about Gypsy Moth, and we got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm just going to jump right into it. So, as Terry mentioned before, my name's Matt. I am the Terrestrial Invasive Species Outreach Coordinator for the Finger Lakes PRISM, PRISM being an acronym standing for Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. We are essentially a collaboration between New York State and Hobart and William Smith colleges with the goal of advancing invasive species outreach, education, and management in the Finger Lakes region. So we cover a 17-county area, everything from Monroe County and Rochester in the west to Syracuse in the east to Binghamton down south. And we're not the only PRISM. We're just one of 8 regional partnerships in New York State. So there are similar organizations to us that cover regions like the Catskills and Long Island and the Adirondacks and so on and so forth. These partnerships are a really great way of tackling invasive species on the local and regional levels. And really, we exist because invasive species are a huge problem here in New York State. And as we all know, Gypsy moth is an invasive species. And before we really dive into talking about Gypsy moth, I think it's just important that we sort of take a step back and we just get some context as to what invasive species actually is. So invasive species are a non-native species to an ecosystem whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. And there's generally a set of characteristics that most invasive species, including Gypsy moth, share with one another that make them successful, but separate them from other species. So typically, when we're talking about invasive species, we're talking about species that have very high reproductive rates, are very aggressive. So these are species that could just grow very quickly. They usually have no natural predators. And this ties into sort of having a really low nutritional value. We sort of call this like the potato chip effect, where invasive species usually are just not very nutritious. So predators don't usually go after them. They'll go after more nutritious native species. And they're really good at taking advantage of human disturbance and all the sorts of changes that humans have been making on the landscape. And you might be thinking, well, like, how does this even happen? Like, how does an invasive species even get here? Well, a lot of the times they can be introduced simply by accident. Usually we think of like international trade. Species are hitching rides on cars and boats and planes, just like we do. But a lot of times they're introduced on purpose, whether that's through things like the pet trade or on landscaping plants. And generally, when we're talking about invasive species, we're talking about organisms that are coming from either Europe or China. And there's 2 main reasons for this. One is that Europe and China and East Asia in general are the areas that we are tied economically the most to. So there's a lot more movement between us and Europe and East Asia than there are between the US and, say, a place like Brazil, right? And also, East Asia and Europe are the 2 places on Earth that are the most similar climatically to us, right? So these are species that are going to be able to survive an upstate New York winter. And the costs of invasive species can often be very widespread and impact a lot of different areas. So we're talking about impacts on agriculture, forestry, tourism. We're talking about environmental impacts on biodiversity, on natural processes, on aesthetics. And we're even talking about, at times, impacts on human health, impacts on like decreased water quality, an increase in flooding, and sometimes even a cause of illness. And I think, just listing these things is one thing, but seeing the sort of damage that invasive species can cause is important as well, right? So like, here's a boat prop that is covered in zebra mussels. As people who live in the Honeyoe Valley area, I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with zebra mussels. Not only do zebra mussels have huge environmental impacts, but they could just have an impact on your boat too, right? These are practical effects on our lives, and they're not just these big abstract environmental problems. But a lot of times the environmental problems can be really serious. This is kudzu. This is a vine originally native to Japan that is a huge invasive species down south. And you can see here, I mean, pretty much like everything is covered in kudzu, like all these trees, all this ground cover, right? If you are an organism trying to make a living in this environment, you are not having a good time, right? Like your life is being made much harder by the presence of kudzu. And we can put numbers on these costs too. Invasive species have directly contributed to hundreds of species extinctions worldwide and the decline of thousands more. And in the US alone, we spend $120 billion every year controlling invasive species. These are huge economic costs that our local, state, and federal governments have to spend each year. And these costs are very high because of, particularly, of one invasive species, one of the most famous invasive species in the world, our dear old friend, the gypsy moth. Gypsy moth is widely considered to be one of the worst invasive species introduced anywhere in all of history. And you don't have to take it from me. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature literally created a list a few years back of the 100 worst invasive species of all time. And I'm sure it would shock none of you to know that our dear old friend the gypsy moth made an appearance on this list. And I think it's really important to show the sort of impacts that gypsy moth can have on a landscape because this invasive species has caused a lot of havoc for a long time. Gypsy moth is a defoliator. So that means that the caterpillars of gypsy moth are eating the leaves of trees. And these are two pictures that show that really clearly, right? This picture in the top right here was taken in Pennsylvania back in the 80s. I mean, you could just see all this brown. These are thousands of trees that have had their leaves defoliated by gypsy moth. This is a more closer up shot of a forest in North Carolina that has had similar effects with gypsy moth, right? So gypsy moth is just can have really big impacts on a landscape-like level, really a lot bigger than a lot of other invasive species that we've seen. So with that being said, what is gypsy moth? Gypsy moth is a moth, as the name implies, originally native to Europe. There are 4 main phases of the gypsy moth life cycle, and we're going to go into these in a little bit more depth later, but just to sort of get acquainted with them for now. Gypsy moth eggs will be laid on usually tree bark. And you'll usually see them with this sort of covering over them. It'll be this sort of like fuzzy, almost hairy, tannish, white, sandy color. And these eggs will eventually hatch into caterpillars. And it's the caterpillar stage that is by far the most important stage in the gypsy moth life cycle, because this is when they are causing the most damage. It is the caterpillars that are eating the leaves of our trees, and they are the ones mostly driving the destruction that we see. These caterpillars are emerging from these eggs, and they are pretty much eating almost 24/7, day in, day out, and over the course of about a month and a half or so, they grow rapidly in size. Once they reach their sort of maximum size as a caterpillar, about midsummer or so, like all moths, they are going to form a cocoon. And in this cocoon, they'll stay in here for about 2 weeks or so. It'll be sort of this brownish burgundy sort of color. And then later on in the summer, they will emerge as fully fledged adults ready to mate and start the next generation of gypsy moths. And gypsy moths are really successful. I don't know if you've caught this. They can feed on over 300 different species of plants. So they really always have an option available to them to eat. And we could sort of break down these different groups of plants that they like to feed on. They like to feed on certain plants more than others. And really, when it comes down to the gypsy moth's favorite food, we are really talking about oaks, oaks, oaks. Gypsy moth loves oak trees. That is their main host. If you have a lot of oak trees on your property, you are probably going to have a lot of gypsy moths. They have other main hosts as well, particularly aspen and poplar trees that they're really going to go after. They have a wide diet and they can feed on other trees, but not necessarily as preferentially as something like oaks or poplars. When we're thinking about trees that gypsy moth occasionally are going to be feeding on, we're talking about trees like maples, walnuts, cherries. They'll feed on these trees, but they're not really going to do it in the numbers that we're going to see on oak trees. And even though gypsy moth does have a really wide diet, it doesn't eat everything. There are trees that gypsy moth just flat out won't touch, right? Things like ash trees, sycamores, and really any herbaceous plants. Gypsy moth is eating woody plants. They're mostly feeding on trees, and occasionally they'll feed on shrubs. Gypsy moths are not going to be feeding on, things like your lawn or your vegetable garden. You might have noticed that I did not mention pine or spruce when I talked about species of concern here. That is because gypsy moth, while they can feed on conifers, they mostly don't preferentially go after them. But when it comes to pine and spruce and sort of conifers in general, these trees are not very well adapted to regrowing a new set of leaves after they've lost them, right? These are evergreen trees. They keep their needles all year long. So while some trees are deciduous trees, can usually handle gypsy moths pretty well, if a pine or a spruce tree starts getting fed on by gypsy moth a lot, this is when we really start to see a lot of mortality. And I want to make it clear here that when gypsy moth is really feeding on our deciduous trees, even if it's something like an oak that they really like to feed on a lot, our trees are literally designed to lose their leaves, right? I mean, they do this every year in the fall. So for the most part, we don't really see huge impacts on our deciduous trees from gypsy moth unless sort of two things happen. One is that we have a lot of consecutive years of defoliation, right? A tree being completely stripped of its leaves, not just 1 or 2 years, but maybe 3, 4, even 5 years in a row. It's really hard for a tree to come back if it's a lot of years. And the other big reason is if a tree is already in an unhealthy state, right? If it's already being attacked by another insect pest, or it's just unhealthy because it's not getting the sort of nutrients that they're getting. And so now we're just going to sort of walk our way through the different life stages of gypsy moth and become acquainted with what it looks like throughout the year. So first and foremost, the egg phase. Gypsy moths are going to be laying their eggs about August, September, and these eggs are going to last throughout the winter, and they're going to hatch in April, May. For the most part, they're going to have this sort of fuzzy appearance, and a lot of the times, if you have a really big outbreak, you can see a lot of them covering a tree. Gypsy moths like to lay their eggs on tree bark primarily, but sometimes you can find them on logs and sometimes even human structures as well, like cars. Each egg mass can contain about 300 to 1,000 eggs. So egg masses can really pump out a lot of caterpillars really quickly. But I do want to make it clear here that the gypsy moth egg masses, when they're laid on your trees, are not harming them. For the most part, they're just superficial. You really need to be worrying about the harm when those eggs hatch and the caterpillars come out. So the caterpillars hatch in early spring, and they're going to be growing throughout the spring and into the early summer. And this is when you're going to see defoliation on your trees. The only time in a gypsy moth's entire life when it is even eating, just flat out eating, is when it's a caterpillar. So gypsy moth caterpillars, when they first hatch from the eggs, so this is a dime right here, they're rather small. This is what they look like, about their size when they're first hatching from the eggs. They're really, really small. But over the course of the weeks as they go on and they're eating more and more food, they will get substantially larger. And I think it's really important that we just get a sense of what gypsy moths caterpillars actually look like in comparison to our native caterpillars, because gypsy moths are not the only caterpillars that are eating the leaves of our trees, but they are the main invasive species that are eating our trees. We have native species of caterpillars that also eat our trees, but these caterpillars are much less of a problem for our tree species. Our tree species have co-evolved with many of these caterpillars, and they are relatively harmless when they are defoliated. So when it comes to being able to tell gypsy moth apart from our native caterpillar species, like eastern tent caterpillar here in the middle and fall webworm here on the right, we're really looking for sort of three different characteristics. So gypsy moth, as in the picture here on the left, as you could see, is much more colorful than our native caterpillar species. Gypsy moth at the front of its body will have these blue dots at the front and red dots going down the middle and the back of its bodies. And it's kind of hard to tell, but the hairs that are coming out of the gypsy moth caterpillar are significantly longer than the hairs that are coming out of something like eastern tent caterpillar and fall webworm. The other main way you're going to be able to tell them apart is just the time of year that they're out. So gypsy moth caterpillars emerge from their egg masses in spring and early summer. So they're out there right now feeding on your trees. Most of our native caterpillar species, they're coming out in late summer, early fall. So they're not really going to become a problem until much later in the year. When we get around to that sort of late summer, early fall time frame, the gypsy moth adults have laid their eggs at that point. So defoliation that you're going to see later on in the year, after the middle of the summer, is not going to be from gypsy moth. The final way that you're really going to be able to tell gypsy moth caterpillars apart from our native caterpillars is the presence of tents. So oftentimes later, especially later on in the summer, you'll see these sort of silky structures, usually on the ends of your tree branches. These are created most often by our native caterpillar species, and they're really not harming the tree in any way. Gypsy moth, on the other hand, doesn't really create these sort of like webby structures. So if you see these later on in the year, that's a sign that this is a relatively harmless native caterpillar species versus a harmful invasive caterpillar like gypsy moth. And the reason why I'm just hammering this home so much is just because there's a lot of misinformation out there about what gypsy moth actually looks like. So I Googled just this morning, gypsy moth caterpillar, and one of the first images that popped up was a native tent caterpillar species, right? You could see that here on the right. So I just think it's important that we just know what we're actually looking at if we're going to be talking about gypsy moths. Moving on, once those gypsy moth caterpillars have fed and they have reached their sort of full size as a caterpillar, they will begin to form their cocoons. These cocoons will form in midsummer, right? Just as we talked about before, they'll have this sort of burgundy sort of coloration. In about 2 weeks, the gypsy moth caterpillars will transform into an adult. And about early, maybe even mid-August or so, the adults will emerge from these cocoons. And the adults of gypsy moths are really interesting because they pretty much just exist to mate. The gypsy moth adults will only live for about a week, maybe a week and a half. And pretty much their entire goal during this time is to make babies. So the gypsy moth males will be smaller and brown in coloration, and they will emerge from their cocoons and they will fly around to look for the females. The females will be slightly larger than the males and white in coloration. And what's really interesting is that even though the females have wings, they actually can't fly. They literally just wait on the trees for the males to eventually come to them. Once the males find the females, and they do this through pheromones through the air, the two will mate. And once the female's eggs have developed, she will lay them on the side of the tree. And pretty much after that, they will just starve to death. Gypsy moth adults do not feed on trees. In fact, they don't eat at all. When I'm saying like they literally just exist to mate, they really just exist to mate. So if you do see the adults later on in the year, just know that really the only problem that they're going to be causing you is just future gypsy moth outbreaks in the future. They themselves are not going to be defoliating your trees. And we could sort of just visualize this life cycle. I really like this sort of chart here. So We have the egg stage here, and remember, they're spending most of their lives as eggs. These eggs are being laid in September. They're lasting all through the winter into the spring. And it's really going to be this sort of 40-day period here, and we're really in the midst of it right now in May and June, that the caterpillars are going to be feeding on trees. Eventually, once those caterpillars fatten up, they're forming cocoons, and then from those cocoons, adults will emerge, they will mate, and the next generation of gypsy moths will be laid. And gypsy moths are really successful because they check a lot of the boxes that we talked about before for what makes an invasive species successful, right? They have a really high reproductive rate. We talked about, there's 300 to 1,000 eggs per egg mass, and there can be thousands of egg masses in a forest. They have very few natural predators. They're really good at taking advantage of disturbance, right? This picture over here in the bottom left, it might be a little hard to tell, but these little yellow marks, these are gypsy moth egg masses that were laid on that tire. So they're really able to take advantage of human dispersal and spread to new areas that humans are moving into. And because they can feed on so many different plant species, they never go hungry, right? They're never going to arrive in an area where there's not going to be something for them to eat. But with all of that being said, there are few natural predators, but that doesn't mean there are no natural predators. Gypsy moth has been in North America for 152 years. And in that time, while gypsy moth still is a problem, and it still is an invasive species, some native animal species have begun to adapt to sort of form checks and balances on the gypsy moth population. Specifically, we've begun to see native and sometimes even invasive wasps and flies parasitize the eggs and the caterpillars of gypsy moths, as well as even some predation coming from mice and shrews and even some birds. And these two groups together have been found to be really effective at keeping the gypsy moth population low and managing gypsy moth numbers when they're relatively low. They're not that effective, however, at making sure the population doesn't take off. And for that, we have two diseases to thank for that are mostly keeping outbreaks in check. So there's a species of fungus called Entomophagus myrmiga. We're just going to call it the fungus, but know that I'm talking about a specific species of fungus from here on out, as well as a specific virus known as NPV. And these two diseases in tandem have been really successful at reducing gypsy moth outbreaks and making sure that if their populations ever get high, their populations are going to come crashing back down. And so with all that being said, you might have caught on to what I just said before, that gypsy moth has been here for 152 years. That's a pretty long time. And you might be thinking, how did gypsy moth get here? Why? I didn't realize it was around for 152 years. And it's a really interesting story as to how gypsy moth actually arrived here in North America. And surprisingly, it's connected to silk. Gypsy moth was intentionally introduced to North America. So it was specifically brought over for a purpose. Originally to Medford, Massachusetts in 1869 by a Frenchman who was looking to create a North American silk industry. So for those of you who don't know, just as a quick aside here, the fibers from silk actually come from the cocoons that caterpillars make when they are looking to turn into adults. You can sort of see that process here in the bottom right. Gypsy moths were brought over from Europe to sort of breed with silk moth species to create some sort of hybrid as part of an experiment. It didn't really work out, and the gypsy moths ended up escaping, and they found their way into the wild, and we've just been dealing with them ever since. When they originally made their way into the wild, for the first 100 years or so, gypsy moth populations grew rather slowly and were limited to New England. Over time, though, the gypsy moth population in New England sort of hit this critical mass where they really began this sort of rapid population expansion across the country, starting in the 60s and really gaining steam in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. So starting in the 70s, gypsy moth population really starts exploding across North America, and they sort of form this invasion front where they are rapidly moving across New York State, they're moving into New Jersey, Pennsylvania, eventually Ohio, Michigan, Kentucky. They're really spreading rapidly throughout the country. And it's during this time that the gypsy moth population finds its way to the Finger Lakes, and specifically it finds its way to the Honeyoe Valley. It's thought that gypsy moth first arrives in our region in the 1980s. And the gypsy moth population is, to this day, continuing to expand southward and westward. But here in the Finger Lakes, we have had an established gypsy moth population for 40 years. And when that population first arrived, we had a massive outbreak in the gypsy moth population, right? So if you remember that picture that I showed at the very beginning of defoliation of gypsy moth, we had a lot of that here when we first had the initial outbreak of gypsy moths in the 1980s. And this is because gypsy moth populations are very cyclical. So they will have long periods where the populations are rather low. And then when conditions are right, that population will explode in a very short amount of time. And they will remain very high for about a 2 to 4 year period. Eventually, once that population reaches a certain size, a lack of food and diseases will cause that population to collapse. The population will remain low for another extended period of time until another outbreak occurs when conditions are right. But we've actually been rather lucky here in the Finger Lakes, because really after the initial arrival of gypsy moths to our region and once that initial outbreak ended, we haven't had any major gypsy moth outbreaks since then. Gypsy moth's been here. It's still been feeding on our trees, but they've been at very, very low levels. And most of that is due to a fungus. The Entomophagus myrmiga fungus, or the fungus that we mentioned earlier, arrived here from Japan at the same time that gypsy moth was arriving to our region. And this fungus has really been a godsend for us because it is one of the most effective controls that we've had at managing the gypsy moth population. So pretty much as soon as gypsy moth got here and that initial outbreak ended, it's this fungus that has been sort of regulating their populations for the last 40 years and keeping them low. And pretty much that's where we are up until today. The gypsy moth outbreaks pretty much ceased as this fungus, as well as the virus, controlled the populations, and we were at pretty low levels until last year. 2020, we saw for the first time since gypsy moth's arrival a huge spike in the population, and many people are wondering why. We're not entirely sure. There's a lot of different factors that go into why a gypsy moth population is going to explode, but we think it's because a large part of it might be because of the dry weather we've been having recently, and that significantly limits the fungus's ability to spread. Last year and continuing into this year, we've had fewer inches of rainfall in our springtime than we have on average. So here in 2020, you could see that we were down 8 inches of rain compared to the average. And this year we're following a similar path. We were down 7 inches so far. And so the thing with fungi, and not just this specific fungus, but just fungi in general, is that fungi need a lot of moisture, especially when the growing season begins, to really establish themselves. And so we're thinking that because we're experiencing less rainfall than usual, the fungus is not as widespread as it used to be, which means that there's nothing keeping the gypsy moth population low, right? You could sort of imagine it as a pot of boiling water. The fungus is the lid that's keeping that water in there, right? Now we've removed the lid, and that population or that water is now allowed to expand outwards beyond its initial constraints. And so with that expansion and without our natural checks and balances to keep the gypsy moth population under control, I'm sure many of you are thinking about what can I do to keep the gypsy moth population under control, right? So you may basically have two main options to work with here. There are chemical treatments and there are mechanical treatments. And so your chemical options, before we really talk about this, I just want to make it very clear that I am not a certified pesticide applicator. I am far from the only definitive source as to what you should do with different chemical options and when. So I would encourage you, if you are thinking about using chemical options to control gypsy moths on your property, to do a lot of research. I'll be sending out a resource after this where you can contact a professional arborist, but really just take what I'm saying as just sort of guidance for what you can do and what you can expect, but I am far from the only definitive source. So when it comes to using chemical options to control gypsy moth, you have a lot of great choices. So there's BT spray, which is a bacteria that kills gypsy moth. There are foliar pesticides. Usually these are spread by either helicopters or planes because you want to hit them up in the canopy of the trees where they're going to be feeding. There are pesticides that you can just inject straight into the trunk of the tree as well. These are great options. They're highly effective. There are really only two pieces of advice that I would offer you if you are thinking about using this. One is that the timing for these pesticides is really key. The gypsy moth caterpillars have already hatched. They're out there right now. And if you are thinking about doing this and you don't have treatment options in place soon, if you do eventually get around to doing it, it might be too little too late, right? Like if you're applying this in, like, let's say late June, well, the gypsy moth damage is already going to have been done. You're not really protecting your trees this year. And I think it's really important to make decisions on whether you're going to use pesticides or not for realistic outcomes for your site, right? So we talked about before, a gypsy moth really likes oaks, but there are a lot of other trees that it does feed on, but it's not going to feed on in huge numbers, right? These are things like maple trees. So if you, on your property, if you have a lot of maple trees, which gypsy moth will eat, but it's not going to go after in large numbers, or you have a lot of like sycamore, let's say, which gypsy moth really doesn't feed on at all, then you don't really need to use pesticides, right? Because your trees are most likely going to be fine. And remember, trees are very resilient. They should be able to come back from 1 or even 2 complete defoliations. And remember that even if you do use pesticides, if a lot of the trees on your site are already in unhealthy conditions, then even controlling the gypsy moth population might not be enough to save your trees from, like, let's say, a nutrient deficiency. So I'm just saying all this just to make sure that I know a lot of people like to, be very gung-ho about pesticides. And for some people, that's a really legitimate option, right? If you have a lot of oaks on your property, you should seriously be considering using chemical pesticides. But it's not the right choice for everyone. And sometimes it doesn't have the outcomes that people think it will. It's not this cure-all. If you are a little hesitant about using pesticides, there are mechanical control options as well. These are effective, but they're not 100% effective, far from it. By far the most famous mechanical control option, is to use sticky traps. So what people will do, they'll put these sticky bands and they'll wrap them around the trunk of their tree. And basically the idea is that the caterpillars will, as they're crawling up and down the tree, they will become stuck to this band and they'll eventually die. This can be a good tool, but it's not 100% effective. You're never going to get all the caterpillars on your tree. So this is not really going to eradicate the problem. It's really just going to diminish the impacts. And gypsy moths can actually pretty much shoot up like a line of silk, and they can actually catch the wind. So gypsy moths can spread to other trees without climbing down the trunks. So a lot of the times they might not even be coming near your sticky traps at all. Another very common way to control gypsy moth populations, this isn't really an option anymore since the eggs have hatched, but this is usually done after the eggs are laid, is to scrape those eggs. A lot of the times, egg scraping is really just a good publicity tool. And I really hate to say it, I've attended gypsy moth egg mass scrapings myself. Some people say that they're a complete waste of time. I don't really believe that, but research has shown that they really don't reduce gypsy moth populations, because at the end of the day, gypsy moths can often lay their eggs in very hard to find spots, so they can be very easy to miss sometimes. And for the most part, they're laying 80% of their eggs or more up in the canopy of the tree. So there's only so many egg masses that you can reach at eye level. It can be good as a way to sort of keep track of the gypsy moth population in your area, but this is not really going to make anything more than a scratch in the population, unfortunately. And so with that being said, we are in the second year of an outbreak. Outbreak started last year in 2020. We are certainly going to have another outbreak year again this year. Possibly going into next year, by maybe at the longest 2023. But for the most part, the current thinking from experts is that once the rains return and we get at least average amounts of rainfall, that fungus will be able to reestablish itself and begin spreading throughout the population again. And remember, there is a very well observed process of gypsy moth populations being cyclical. They will eventually collapse. They'll run out of food. The virus will start spreading. The fungus will start spreading. And the population will inevitably collapse. The question is whether it's going to be at the end of this year or whether it's going to be at the end of 2022 or 2023. And so with all that being said, for a lot of you, your best option really might be just to do nothing. Gypsy moth has been in North America for 152 years at this point. In fact, a lot of the trees on your property, if they are more than 40 years old, they were around and survived the first gypsy moth outbreak that we experienced a long time ago. So don't take this, I'm not saying this as a way to say don't use any control methods at all. If you had a huge gypsy moth outbreak last year and you have a lot of oaks and maybe you have a lot of pines as well, I would seriously consider looking into control methods. But for a lot of people, doing nothing really might just be your best bet. The caterpillars are already out. They're already feeding on your trees. The impact has already been made last year. It's going to be made this year. There's really only so much you can do. And remember, a lot of the damage that gypsy moth can have on a tree is really because of if that tree is already stressed because of something else, right? If it's lacking water or nutrients, or there's another pest attacking it. Gypsy moths really don't usually end up killing the trees on their own. Our trees are very resilient. They can come back from defoliation. So take for this what you will. If you feel that you need to use some sort of control method, I would do more research into this. But if you're someone who has a yard full of cherry trees and hickories, I would really consider your best bet just be waiting it out. And a lot of this is because this is sort of the attitude that the New York State and federal government have taken to gypsy moth over the last 20, 30 years. We have really not been controlling gypsy moth on a widespread scale since probably about the year 2000. Most of our efforts right now are really focused on controlling the spread of gypsy moth, right? That we talked about before, the gypsy moth population front is still expanding southwards and westwards. But here, if you look at these pictures here, this gray area represents where Gypsy Moth is currently established. And you can see with slow the spread measures in place, we've actually been really successful at reducing the Gypsy Moth population spread from an explosion really down to a crawl. And this is really where most of the efforts are being placed right now. And you could see here, without these slow the spread efforts, Gypsy Moth would have been found all over the eastern seaboard by 2040. So really the focus now, and this is the focus at really higher up levels, is we're focusing on slowing the spread. We're not really focusing on eradicating Gypsy Moth at a local level, because the thing is, it's been here since 1869. It's a part of our ecosystem now. It's not going away. Excuse me. So while we are working to slow the spread of Gypsy Moth, there is another invasive species who we are having a much harder time to slow the spread with, and that is spotted lanternfly. Some of you may have heard of spotted lanternfly before. Some of you might be hearing about it now for the first time. But spotted lanternfly has the potential to be the next Gypsy Moth. This is a very scary invasive species. Spotted lanternfly was just detected in North America in 2014, and in the 7 years since it's been detected, it has completely overrun the areas where it's been found, right? You can see this tree here. I mean, it is just covered in spotted lanternflies, right? And you can see this in this picture in the bottom right here too. And if you notice in the top right, the plant that spotted lanternflies are feeding on here, you might notice, if you're a keen observer, that they are feeding on a grapevine. Spotted lanternfly is a huge pest for grapevines and fruit trees, which is something that's particularly scary for us here in the Finger Lakes. Spotted lanternfly, as I said before, was first detected in 2014 in Philadelphia, and it's originally native to China. And they come in sort of three distinctive life phases. So when spotted lanternflies first hatch from their eggs, they'll be rather small. They'll be black with white spots on them. And as they grow up, they'll sort of increase in size, and they'll eventually get these red stripes down their backs. And then eventually, once they become fully fledged adults, they'll grow these really big pink wings with black spots on them. Spotted lanternfly is a really distinct insect. Unlike what we talked about with Gypsy Moth before, there is pretty much nothing you can confuse spotted lanternfly with in all of North America. And they're really sizable insects too. And many times the adults can reach over an inch long. And so spotted lanternfly, in the past 7 years that it's been here, has pretty much spread to an area that Gypsy Moth spread in its first 100 years. So a big problem right now that we're having with spotted lanternfly is that it's really just spreading way faster than we can keep up with. This blue area represents areas where spotted lanternfly has been found, and it's made its way as of last year into New York State. It's made its way into the lower Hudson region. It's made its way onto Staten Island. It's made its way onto Long Island, and it's made its way into Ithaca here in Tompkins County. So it is here in upstate New York, and we need to keep an eye on it. And we need to keep an eye on it, like what I was saying before, because it's not just a ecological pest. So spotted lanternfly does feed on maple trees and walnuts, which we have in abundance here in upstate New York. But the economic impact of spotted lanternfly really is huge. I cannot understate it. These insects have been one of the worst pests ever observed on grapevines. Often, these are pests that can outright kill grapevines. Not only just grapevines, but fruit trees as well, most notably apple trees, right? And we have apple trees in abundance as well up here in upstate New York, as well as hops vines too. So spotted lanternfly sort of affects another dimension that Gypsy Moth doesn't really touch at all, right? Gypsy Moth is really a sort of ecological pest. It can affect us economically too, in costs that are associated with long-term management and maybe forestry, impacts on forestry and sort of private sector, um, lawn trees. But spotted lanternfly can really affect, our agricultural economy, right? And here in the Finger Lakes, as much as we value our grapevines and our vineyards and our apple orchards, spotted lanternfly can really do a number on these guys. The damage that it's estimated, if spotted lanternfly eventually does reach large population levels that we've seen, in Pennsylvania, are in the hundreds of millions of economic activity. And right now, we talked about, how mice and shrews and other insects can feed on spotted lanternflies and sort of keep their population in check, and how feed on gypsy moths and keep their populations in check. But there is none of that for what we've seen for spotted lanternfly. And most notably, there is no fungus. There is no virus that we've seen so far that can keep these guys in check. They are really expanding as quickly as they possibly can. And like I said before, they've reached an area from as far north as New York and as far south as Virginia in just 7 years than Gypsy Moth did in 100. Remember, Gypsy Moth didn't really start expanding outside of New England until the 1960s, 1970s, and spotted lanternfly is already up and down the East Coast. And so far, unfortunately, what we've seen, at least from limited data in Pennsylvania, is that there are no known population cycles. It's expected that spotted lanternfly populations will eventually collapse. There are no organisms that could sustain populations this high for this long, but we don't really see that sort of cyclical nature, that predictability that we see in gypsy moth populations, that we see in spotted lanternfly populations. One year their population might explode, and then the next year their population could maybe just go down a little bit, or it might go even higher. It really fluctuates on a lot of levels. And so I just encourage you all to really just keep an eye out on spotted lanternfly, because the thing is that it's a really distinct insect. It's actually really easy to identify, right? So the 4 life stages of spotted lanternfly are very easy to keep track of. The eggs are sort of similar to the gypsy moth egg masses, except with spotted lanternfly, the egg masses are more gray, and they're more of like a smoother sort of putty texture if you were to touch them, versus sort of like the hairy texture of gypsy moth egg masses. And when we talked about the distinct life stages before, you're going to see these little nymphs out in spring. You're going to see them grow and become red in coloration in the summer. And then by late summer, early fall, you're going to see the adults, and they're going to be mating. And unlike gypsy moth, the adults of spotted lanternfly feed as well. It's feeding throughout its entire life cycle. So it's not just feeding at a very discrete time of the year. And just sort of one last comparison of the two, this is the range of gypsy moth here in New York State. The green represents where it's found. Gypsy moth is here. It's not going away. And we just sort of have to live with it, right? Spotted lanternfly, on the other hand, is spreading very fast, but as of right now, it's only found in one county here in upstate New York. So at least the positive thing that we can look forward to with spotted lanternfly is that if enough people are on the lookout for it, we can actually contain its population and make sure that this does not become the next gypsy moth. If you're interested, there are a lot of great resources to help manage the spotted lanternfly invasion. If you think you find a spotted lanternfly, it's a really simple process to report it. You just take a picture and you email that picture and the location of where you found it to spottedlanternfly@agriculture.newyork.gov. And New York State will come out and they'll delineate where the spotted lanternfly was found. There's another program through IMAP Invasives. This is basically an app that you can get on your phone, where if you're interested, you can keep track of go out and actually survey for spotted lanternfly populations in your area. And this sort of data from volunteers is actually really helpful in finding out where spotted lanternfly is, because out of the 3 populations of spotted lanternfly that we found in New York State, 2 of them were found just by volunteers, not by experts in the field, but just normal everyday people. So you guys can actually have a really great impact if you're interested in helping out. If you're interested, feel free to email me about it, and I could get you in touch. But with that being said, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time out of your day to hear me speak about Gypsy Moth and spotted lanternfly. I hope you learned a thing or two. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot them down in the chat box below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Otherwise, you can shoot me an email at gallo@hws.edu if you have any other questions that you'd like to ask at a later time. But really, sincerely thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it, and I'm glad you're all interested in invasive species. Thank you.
Well, Matt, thank you very much on behalf of the 28 people that were here tonight, and we'll look forward to doing this again on a different topic soon.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, thanks everybody.
Oh, if we have any questions, can hang around here.
There is one on the chat now.
How do SLF stay in check in China? So spotted lanternfly in China mainly stays in check because in China, there are diseases that are adapted to keep the population in check, and predators as well. So this is sort of what we were talking about with the gypsy moth fungus, right? So the gypsy moth fungus is sort of keeping that population low. We don't have anything like that here in North America, and that's why spotted lanternfly is spreading out of control. There are those diseases and other predators in China that can eat spotted lanternfly and that can infect spotted lanternfly. And that's why over there, their populations are not out of control, because the ecosystem is adapted to dealing with them. And I realized that question was sent as a direct message to me, so the rest of you did not see it, but it was how do SLF stay in check in China? Does anyone have any other questions? All right, it appears that we don't have any other questions. Thank you again for attending. And if you do have a question that you'd still like to send, feel free to just shoot me an email and I'll do my best to answer. But thanks guys for coming. I really appreciate it. I hope you all have a good night.